Welcome to the Athlete Archives. In 147 years of Major League Baseball, there have been some real interesting stories. Today, I'll tell you about one athlete whose record I don't expect will ever be broken. Due to some unique circumstances, including a world war and a complete lack of racial integration in the game, the talent pool for professional baseball was severely limited in 1944. As a result, a 15-year-old boy ended up pitching in the major leagues for the Cincinnati Reds. The kid, who was pitching against ninth graders just months earlier, found himself facing Stan Musial and the St. Louis Cardinals at Crosley Field. It did not go well. At least not that day. But this is a story of a kid who didn't quit. He grew into a man and continued to work on his craft and returned to the majors many years later. He ended up building a nice career in baseball. This is the story of Joe Nuxhall, the youngest player in Major League Baseball history. Less than 0.5% of the players in Major League Baseball history did not start their careers in the minor leagues. To be specific, that's 103 players in total as of 2023. But that 103 really wouldn't even be that many if it weren't for what is known as the bonus babies. Let me share a little history. As the U.S. entered World War II, players were leaving the game to serve in the military. The owners were battling each other to sign young talent and were offering larger and larger signing bonuses in order to retain the top prospects. There was no MLB draft yet. It got to the point where the competitive balance was so heavily shifted in the teams with the most money, and rich clubs were paying big bonuses, stashing all of this young talent in their farm teams, that Major League Baseball had to step in. MLB ended up implementing the bonus rule in 1947. This mandated that any player assigned to a team with a bonus of $4,000 or more had to be on the active 25-man roster for 2 full seasons. They could not be sent down to the minor leagues. The bonus rule remained in effect until 1965, when the MLB draft was started. With the bonus rule in place from 1947 to 65, there were 60 of these bonus babies. 60 bonus babies of the 103 total players in history that started right in the major leagues. What I'm trying to drive home is that if you took the bonus baby rule away, there would easily be half of the 103 players in history that skipped the minor leagues. In fact, since 1995, there have only been 3. It's very rare. Joe Nuxhall is one of the rare players on this list. If you're from Cincinnati, I have no doubt that you know Joe's story. He's a legend in Ohio, not just because he came up with the Reds, but because he was also a part of the Reds radio broadcast for decades. There's a statue of him outside the Great American Ballpark. The guy's a true Ohio hero. Let's dive into Joe's story. Joe Nuxhall was born July 30th, 1928 in Hamilton, Ohio. His father, Orville, played semi-pro baseball. In December of 41, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entered World War II. As was the case with World War I, many baseball players left the game to go to war, including Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Warren Spahn, and many others. In fact, according to baseballandwartime.com, over 500 major league players would end up serving in World War II. The call to service was so widespread that they almost stopped playing baseball, but President Roosevelt wrote his famous green light letter. It was a response to a letter from Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Landis had wrote the president and said, quote, "If you believe we ought to close down for the duration of the war, we are ready to do so immediately. If you feel we ought to continue, we would be delighted to do so. We await your order." Roosevelt responded the next day. In part, quote, I honestly feel that it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. There will be fewer people unemployed, and everybody will work longer hours and harder than ever before. Teams needed whatever players they could find. With that said, teams brought older players out of retirement or signed players who, if not for the war, wouldn't be playing for performance reasons. Some teams went after college talent and semi-pro players, and that's how the Reds found Orville Nuxhall. The Reds originally focused on Orville in 1943, but they noticed his son Joe. Joe was only 14, but he was a big kid at 6'3", and he could pitch. Cincinnati signed him on February 18, 1944 with a $500 signing bonus and a $175 a month salary. The Reds intended to keep him off the roster until ninth grade ended. But Joe's principal let him suit up and be on the field for opening day. When the school year ended, Joe joined the big league club, and he sat on the bench until June 10, just 4 days after D-Day. The Reds were losing 13-0 when Joe was called in for relief. He tripped on the top step of the dugout. He was so nervous. Joe got his first batter out, Cardinals' George Fallon, on a ground ball. Then reality set in. 2 hits, including a single to Stan Musial, 5 walks, and 5 earned runs before getting the hook in 2/3 of an inning. That's a 67.5 ERA and a 10.5 whip. That was Joe's only appearance for the season. He was sent down to the Birmingham Barons of Southern Association Class A1. He pitched only 1 more inning that summer, and it was a pretty similar experience. He walked 5 and allowed 6 earned runs. The following season, the 16-year-old Nuxhall improved considerably. He posted a .321 ERA over 23 games, pitching for both the Syracuse Chiefs in Double-A and the Lima Reds in Class D ball. Despite his young age, he struck out an impressive 41 batters in 27 innings at Lima. After the 1945 season, Nuxhall voluntarily retired from baseball and returned to Hamilton High School. That's not something you hear very often. He would head back to school and back to being as normal of a teenager as he could. But he wasn't done with baseball. Huge credit to Joe, he kept working and continued to develop as a pitcher. 8 years later, he was back in the majors, again with Cincinnati. His second appearance would go much differently than his first. 3 innings pitched, 3 Ks, 0 walks, 1 hit, 0 earned runs. This math is easy. ERA, 0. WHIP, 0.333. He would continue to have success that year, 1952. In fact, he would go on to pitch for another 15 years in the majors, totaling 2,302 innings, beyond his original 2/3 of an inning from 1944. In 1955 and 56, Joe would be named an All-Star. In 55, he would throw a career-high 257 innings, winning a career-best 17 games, and was the ace of the Reds staff. In 1961, Joe would be traded to the A's, where he would play 1 year before becoming a free agent. He would then sign with the Orioles and then be sold to the Angels, only to be released a month later. The Reds would pick him back up, and he would finish his career with 5 more years in Cincinnati. Nuxhall was inducted into the Reds Hall of Fame in 1968, less than a year after his playing career had ended. After finishing his playing career, Joe stayed with the Reds, this time as a member of the radio broadcast team. Nuxhall partnered with Jim McIntyre and Al Michaels, and then beginning in 1974, he was teamed up with Marty Brennaman. Marty and Joe, they broadcast games together for 31 seasons. Nuxie battled prostate cancer in 1992 and had a heart attack in 2001, but stayed in the Reds radio booth until 2004. Over 60 years after his professional debut, Joe Nuxhall officially retired as a full-time broadcaster. Nuxhall remained active, especially with activities and charities that benefited his hometown. He started the Joe Nuxhall Memorial Scholarship in 1985 And in 2003, he started the Joe Nuxhall Character Education Fund, which supports workshops and grants for teachers, coaches, and others who work with children. Nuxhall was diagnosed in 2003 with lymphoma and died on November 15, 2007. He was 79 years old. I should mention that Joe was not the only teenager to play during World War II. There were a couple of 16-year-olds that played that season. Joe was the youngest, but more importantly, he was the only one to come back and play after the war. He built a real solid playing career and, by all accounts, an excellent broadcasting career. I'll end this episode with 3 minutes I've excerpted from an interview with Nuxie in 1972. This is Joe, in his own words, describing his Major League Baseball debut. The interviewer was Kit Chrissy, and I was able to get the interview through my membership in Sabre. Thank you for listening. Here is Joe.
Mr. Nuxhall, will you tell me about the conditions surrounding your signing by the Reds in 1944 to pitch?
Well, actually, I was tried out in 1943 when I was 14 years old with the Reds, and then I was in junior high school, the 8th grade, and I told the Reds that I would like to finish the 9th grade at junior high. Of course, they're separate, you know, 3 grades in junior high, and then, of course, 4 years of high school. But I asked them if I'd be all right to finish my 9th grade junior high to play basketball, which I did, and then signed in 1944, February. And of course, at that time, it was during the Second World War, and they were looking for ball players all over the place, and anything that showed any signs of being a ball player, well, I think they tried to grab. And at that time, I was a big fellow, a big kid. I stood 6'3", weighed 195 pounds, and could throw hard, but other than that, why, not much going for me. No curveball, no changeup, or any other pitch at all, just being able to throw the ball hard. But the first game against the Cardinals was Saturday afternoon, and the Cardinals had us 13-0 in the 8th inning, I believe, if I'm correct. And 2/3 of the inning I pitched, I allowed 5 runs, 2 hits, 2 wild pitches, and 5 earned runs. So it was kind of a wild thing for me. But when I look back on it and think about it, why, I doubt very much if I would ever do it again. If I would have the opportunity, or if I had a son that had the opportunity, which nowadays, of course, can't be done. But the experience of the traveling and everything at that time, being a 15-year-old kid, never been away from home, why, it was kind of scary, because in that ball game, when I came into the game, if I remember, I got it home. I remember correctly, the first guy grounded out, then I walked the next guy, and then I believe the next one popped up. And then I started walking him, and Musial got one of the hits, and Stan still talks about it himself, about a wild kid out there. I think I'd walked about 4 by the time I got to Musial, and the first pitch was over the plate. He just hit a screaming line drive into right field, as if I was a needle threader. And then I think George Fallon got the other hit, and then while wild pitched, and I believe I walked another one, and that's when I was taken out of the ball game. But the thing that amazed me, Stan Musial, a great hitter, and really, I guess you'd have to say he was, I wouldn't say in his prime, but yet he was quite a ways along as far as a hitter, and for him to step up there and just nonchalant as the devil, against a wild kid, a 15-year-old kid, and act like he didn't care where I was throwing, but the first one I threw over, he hit.
You say, were you nervous? Did you have butterflies?
Oh, scared to death. You have to, like I like to say, 2 weeks prior to that, I was facing 13, 14-year-old kids in junior high school, and now all of a sudden I have to face Stan Musial.